Oh God, what is this name? Take this back at once!
The city never slept. Its streets hummed with the constant pulse of ambition, car horns, and distant music spilling from crowded marketplaces. Even in grief, life pressed forward, unforgiving and unyielding. From the high glass towers to the narrow alleys below, the city moved with a rhythm that ignored sorrow. Smoke rose from tiny kitchens tucked between concrete walls, children's laughter collided with the roar of buses, hawkers' cries pierced the air. Death, even in its most sacred form, could not pause the city's heartbeat. Amid this relentless motion stood a woman dressed in black. Her eyes were red from nights without sleep, her hands trembled slightly, yet her back remained straight. She carried the weight of loss, but also the memory of a man whose name had been greater than his wealth. Her father had been known not for riches, but for the strength of his word. In their neighborhood, elders spoke of him with reverence. A man like him walks the earth and leaves no shadow of shame. He had tilled the land, helped neighbors quietly, and taught his children that honor was earned in deeds, not measured in coins. He had worn patched clothes, yet every gesture radiated integrity. In the marketplace or under the shade of the baobab tree, his presence commanded respect without demanding it. When the drumbeat of mourning called the community together, the streets filled with faces both familiar and solemn. Women in colorful wraps gathered near the courtyard, singing the traditional dirge, voices rising in sorrow and memory. Elders circled the coffin, recounting the father's life in words heavy with respect. Children, curious and hushed, watched their elders bow heads and fold hands. The air was thick with smoke from burning incense, carrying prayers skyward, as if the city itself had to be reminded of ancestral ties, of human duty amidst its endless noise. Yet even in this sacred gathering, whispers slid beneath the folds of black cloth. "Did he leave much?" a cousin murmured. "I hear she struggles already. How will she manage without him?" Their voices were soft but sharp, measuring grief against the currency of inheritance. Eyes darted, weighing her standing in the community, noting the emptiness of her purse against the fullness of her sorrow. The city's gaze, though silent, was heavy with judgment. At the edge of the gathering, her husband stood, a man polished and poised, yet strangely distant. His shoes gleamed under the sun, his suit pressed to perfection, yet there was no warmth in his eyes. He spoke little, nodded to elders with a practiced respect, but his mind seemed elsewhere, already chasing the next deal, the next opportunity, the next image of success. The distance between him and the grieving woman was more than physical. It was a chasm of ambition versus tradition, of wealth versus honor, of a heart that had turned away from the rituals that once bound them. He leaned slightly on the edge of the coffin, hands folded, and whispered what seemed to her an empty condolence. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, but his eyes flicked over the crowd, noting appearances, measuring status. She felt the sting, not of the words, but of the absence behind them. In that moment, she understood how deeply the city could mirror the human heart, relentless, indifferent, and often blind to what truly mattered. Around them, the city thrummed, uncaring of grief, yet she remained rooted, like a tree planted deep by her father's hands, refusing to bend to the wind of indifference. Once, love had grown softly between them, like the first green shoots after a dry season. In the beginning, their days were quiet and tender. Mornings spent laughing over shared tea, evenings filled with stories under the fading sun. He had looked at her with eyes full of wonder, as if discovering a secret that no one else could touch. She had believed in their small, fragile world, where honor and affection held more weight than gold or power. But the city had a way of changing hearts. Its glass towers reflected ambition back like mirrors, and the sound of coins clinking became louder than whispers of love. His eyes, once warm, now measured her against status, against appearances, against the image he wanted to project. She could feel it in the way he no longer lingered to ask about her day, in the subtle sighs when she mentioned their modest beginnings, in the quiet shame she carried when neighbors spoke of wealth and achievement. Slowly, love turned brittle, replaced by comparison and quiet humiliation. She tried to hold on to what remained, but the weight of his ambition pressed her down. She was no longer the center of his world. She had become a reminder of what he wished to forget. Her modest dress, the simple meals she prepared, the old ways she clung to, they were all evidence of a life he wanted buried beneath the city's bright lights. She noticed the way he avoided her eyes in public, how he straightened his suit with careful precision before passing her in the courtyard, as though she were a shadow he could step over. Her grief was still fresh, a wound that had barely begun to close when he chose that moment to deliver the ultimate judgment. I cannot keep doing this, he said, voice flat, eyes flicking past her to the bustling street outside. It has run its course. She blinked, heart stalling. Run its course, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. Without another gesture, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 note, holding it between two fingers like it could replace years of loyalty, shared sorrow, and quiet love. Here, he said, voice cold, as though it were the final settlement of an account. Take it and go. The note fell into her hand, light yet heavier than any stone. $10. A sum so small it mocked the depth of what had been. In that moment, love, trust, and marriage were reduced to a coin, a transaction stripped of every memory they had built together. She stood frozen for a heartbeat, then felt the chill of the city around her. The doors of the home, once a haven of warmth and laughter, now closed behind her with finality. She stepped onto the street, the crowd of commuters and passers-by moving around her without notice, the city itself watching without mercy. Every footstep echoed like judgment. Her arms clutched the crumpled bill, her heart clutching the memory of her father, her first love, her home, all taken in one swift motion. Under the same sky where she had buried her father only days before, loss stacked upon loss. The sun that had once promised warmth now beat down with indifference. Her marriage lay in ruins, her father was gone, and her security, both emotional and financial, had vanished like morning mist. The city hummed on, uncaring and relentless, and she, small and alone, felt the weight of life pressing down from all sides. She walked forward, each step trembling yet deliberate, carrying grief that was both familiar and new. The world had stripped her bare, yet even in despair, a spark of her father's teachings, a quiet dignity, the knowledge that life demanded endurance, remained tucked deep inside her. She stood alone under the dim light of the street lamp, the weight of the city pressing down from all sides. The home that once promised warmth and laughter had closed its doors behind her, and the traditions meant to protect her seemed to have vanished like morning mist. Silence wrapped around her, heavy and complete, yet within it simmered a small ember of her father's teachings, a quiet strength that refused to bow, even when the world had turned its back. She breathed deeply, letting the grief settle into her bones, knowing that endurance would be the first step toward justice. The nights that followed were long and unkind. Sleep became a stranger, slipping away while shadows danced across the walls of her tiny rented room. The darkness was not only outside, it was inside her heart, pressing upon her chest with the weight of loss and humiliation. Every sound, the distant honk of a car, the shouting of children in the alley, the drip of water from a broken pipe, reminded her that life did not pause for sorrow. She learned quickly that survival was not only physical, it was a battle of patience, of quiet perseverance, and of holding on to dignity when the city threatened to strip it away. Her footsteps took her to corners of the city where dreams went to hide. Narrow alleyways led to overcrowded rooms where families shared a single bed, where the air smelled of smoke and sweat, and where hunger whispered in every quiet moment. The streets were unsafe, lit only by flickering neon signs and the occasional street lamp. She watched mothers cradle children while trading favors for food, and men and women walked with careful eyes, guarding secrets as precious as gold. The underbelly of the city revealed itself slowly, a place where hope was fragile and life was measured not by ambition, but by the ability to endure one more day. Yet even in these shadows, hands reached out. Women who had nothing still offered bread, water, and advice. In whispers, they shared what little they had, teaching her how to carry herself, how to bargain for work, how to find trust in a city that often denied it. They did not ask for recognition. There was no applause or thanks. Their survival depended on each other, and in their quiet solidarity, she found the first glimmer of community beyond bloodlines. She learned that resilience was not a solitary pursuit, but a shared rhythm, a song passed between those who refused to break. The $10 note she still carried burned like shame in her pocket. At first, she could not bring herself to touch it. It reminded her of betrayal, of the love that had been traded for coins, and of the man who had reduced a lifetime of connection to a mere token. She pressed it between her palms, feeling its weight, knowing it represented both humiliation and opportunity. Pride and necessity warred within her. She refused to let survival feel like surrender, but hunger spoke in ways words never could. And so, when the gnawing in her stomach could no longer be ignored, She used the money to buy a simple meal. Each bite was heavy with meaning, not shame, but acknowledgement of a life she refused to abandon. Small beginnings, planted in pain, gave her strength she had not known she possessed. The streets, the shadows, the nights without rest, all of it became her teacher. In the quiet endurance of survival, she learned the first lesson her father had whispered long ago: dignity was not in comfort, but in the courage to continue when all else had been stripped away. The $10 note had long stopped being money. It had become a seed, hidden in the dust of her new life, waiting for the rain of effort and determination to make it grow. Each morning, she counted her small victories: a meal earned, a room cleaned, a favor returned. She learned that survival demanded patience, that even the smallest gesture could sprout something larger. With each task, each careful step through the crowded streets, the humiliation that had weighed her down began to transform. The coin that once mocked her now symbolized her resilience, the proof that even from the ashes of betrayal, life could push upward, searching for light. Bitterness came often, tapping on her mind like a persistent drum. She thought of his polished shoes, his dismissive glance, and the ease with which he had discarded her. Yet she did not respond with fury. Her dignity, taught by her father and honed through hardship, refused to leave. When neighbors whispered or stared, she walked with measured steps, her silence louder than any shout. "Let them judge," she murmured one evening to a friend who brought her stew. "I will not give them the satisfaction of my anger." Her restraint became her shield, her quiet rebellion against a world that measured women by error rather than endurance. And in the quiet, her father's voice returned to her. "Remember who you are," he would say, "in memory and in instinct. The world may twist, but your heart must stay true." Even when hunger gnawed and her body ached, his words guided her choices: when to speak, when to walk, when to work, and when to refuse compromise. His wisdom was the compass that kept her upright, a moral map etched in memory, directing her through a city that often forgot the value of humility and honor. Some days, she wondered about fate. Was this life the punishment of destiny, or the consequence of effort? Could she change the course of what the city had marked for her, or was she merely a shadow moving through the designs of the gods? In every decision, whether to knock on a door, barter for a small job, or walk past a mocking neighbor, she tested herself. African wisdom whispered that fate could be bent, but only by action. And so she acted, step by step, choosing work over complaint, endurance over despair. Yet the city had its own rules. It forgave men who failed and faltered, but women were marked for every misstep. The streets murmured their judgment, neighbors shook heads, and whispers slipped through markets like poisonous wind. Divorce, poverty, or a single moment of weakness branded women more harshly than any crime. She felt the sting daily: doors closed, offers withdrawn, hands that should have helped instead pointing, murmuring, cataloging her failure. Public silence covered private blame, and she learned to navigate a world where her worth was constantly measured against her gender rather than her effort. People labeled her before they ever spoke her name. They saw the torn dress, the worn shoes, the small bag she carried, and assumed weakness, failure, and insignificance. Her strength went unnoticed, hidden beneath layers of poverty and quiet labor. "She is nothing," some said. Yet what they did not see was a woman learning to survive with grace, turning each scar into a lesson, each rejection into a stepping stone. In their blindness, she found freedom, her power invisible until she was ready to wield it. Step by step, she learned the city's language: how to negotiate, how to earn trust, how to keep her head low while planting seeds for growth. Each scar, each small hardship, became part of her education. She learned which streets were safe, which people could be trusted, how to turn tiny earnings into opportunities, and how to maintain dignity while asking for help. Survival turned slowly into progress. By the end of each day, she would return to her small room, weary but confident, knowing that tomorrow, the city itself would witness the woman she was becoming, quietly strong, unbowed, and patient. Every small victory she earned went unnoticed by the city that had already judged her. A job completed, a favor returned, a skill learned, these were quiet triumphs, almost invisible beneath the roar of the streets and the chatter of neighbors. Yet each success rebuilt the fragile trust she had in herself. She learned to walk without flinching, to bargain without trembling, to smile without expecting recognition. "One day," she whispered to herself while counting coins earned from a small task, "one day they will see what I've become." Confidence returned slowly, like a river carving its path beneath the earth, unseen but unstoppable. Her strength grew in silence, hidden and patient. It was not the kind the city could applaud, nor the kind that could be flaunted. Like roots beneath concrete, her power spread quietly, anchoring her to the ground. Each hardship endured, each hunger resisted, each insult ignored, added depth to her resilience. She carried the lessons of her father in her chest, a compass for every choice. In secret, she prepared for a reckoning that the city, and her husband, could never anticipate. Meanwhile, her husband rose higher into the light. His name was spoken with admiration in offices, restaurants, and social circles. He smiled in photographs and shook hands with people who believed in his success. From the outside, everything looked perfect: wealth, influence, a life of triumph. But behind closed doors, his shadow lengthened. The emptiness that grew within him stretched wider than any applause could reach. He had gained the world yet lost the compass that once kept his heart anchored. Every deal, every handshake, and every toast cemented a moral imbalance he could not yet see. Even in rooms filled with admiration and laughter, his heart grew cold. The warmth that had once connected him to his wife, to his family, and to any sense of humility, had been replaced with a rigid desire for status. Betrayal had become normal. The harshness he had shown her was now the measure of his strength. And yet, in his rising power, seeds of downfall were quietly planted. The city may have cheered, but it could not cheer the hollowness that gnawed within him. Meanwhile, the injustice that had struck her still slept but was far from dead. She carried her scars like quiet armor, learning, growing, preparing for the day when the scales would balance. African wisdom whispered that no wrongdoing could escape its reckoning, even if it delayed. The city, the people, and the man who had cast her aside all moved forward, blind to the truth. Delayed justice is not absent justice. And in the silent corners of her life, patience took root, waiting for the moment when her efforts, her dignity, and her endurance would meet the justice that had been postponed. 5 reigns had passed since she had walked the streets as a woman stripped of dignity. Seasons turned, bringing the scent of wet earth, the sound of leaves whispering in the wind, and the heavy patter of rain that cleansed the alleys and the souls who walked them. The city had changed. Buildings had risen, paint freshened, and markets thrummed with new energy, yet even as the city transformed, its heart remained the same, a place that measured worth in appearances, coin, and fleeting admiration. And yet, in these changing streets, a new presence emerged, one the city had not yet learned to see, a woman who had endured, who had grown in the quiet, and whose name now carried weight, though few could pronounce it fully. She returned without asking permission. No herald, no fanfare, no announcement that demanded attention. Her steps were measured but confident, each footfall speaking of patience, effort, and survival. Those who had once dismissed her whispered as she passed, noticing the subtle shift in her posture, the calm certainty in her gaze. She did not glance at the familiar faces or seek their approval. She carried herself as one who had learned the language of the city and the rhythm of its hidden paths. Strength, she had discovered, was not in shouting, but in walking steadily while the world tried to ignore you. The city could no longer recognize the woman she had become. Gone was the trembling figure who once clutched 10 crumpled dollars in fear and shame. In her place stood composure, a reclaimed identity forged from struggle. Her pain no longer introduced her. It was the shadow of her past, acknowledged only in the quiet corners of memory. Where once she had been measured by failure, now she measured herself by resilience, wisdom, and the dignity that hardship had taught her to carry. Her success had been built quietly. There were no drums to announce her arrival, no songs sung in her honor. She worked with integrity, relying on community support rather than seeking glory for herself. Skills learned, connections nurtured, trust earned, these were her foundations. Each achievement was a brick in a home of her own making, solid and lasting. In the African way, respect had to be earned, not bought or borrowed, and her patience and perseverance ensured that the city would come to know her worth, even if silently at first. And slowly, her name began to travel, spoken softly in markets, offices, and meeting halls. Yet the softness of the voice did not diminish its power. Those who had once dismissed her now listened, sought her counsel, and respected her judgment. Influence flowed from quiet authority rather than spectacle. In high places, her reputation grew, surpassing the fleeting glitter of wealth, for she had earned trust where it mattered most, and it followed her like a shadow that refused to leave. One day, the city rose in applause, not knowing whose story they celebrated, nor the long years of quiet struggle that had shaped the woman they now honored. Hands clapped, voices cheered, yet the crowd was blind to the journey, the pain, and the patient toil that had brought her to this moment. Irony hung in the air. The same city that had judged, whispered, and ignored her now celebrated her without recognition of her past. And in the midst of the applause, she stood with calm eyes and steady breath, letting the city honor what it had once overlooked, knowing that justice, patience, and perseverance had done what anger never could. The applause that had once filled his halls now echoed hollow. Each cheer, each toast, each congratulatory hand had lost its warmth. Cracks appeared in the life he had built on admiration and power. Deals faltered, whispers spread, and the ease with which he had commanded attention began to crumble. The city that once bowed to him now carried rumors like sharp winds through narrow streets. He moved among people, yet the energy that had once surrounded him had thinned, leaving a quiet chill in its place. Success, he realized too late, could be fragile when it was built on appearances rather than integrity. Betrayal, he thought, was a distant memory, a tool wielded only by others. But now it returned to him like a mirror held too close. Every misstep he had caused, every slight he had ignored, every dismissal of dignity now reflected back with unbearable clarity. Trust once given so freely was dissolving around him. Allies whispered doubts. Partners questioned motives. Even friends glanced at him with suspicion. The moral consequences of his choices were awakening, patient yet relentless, like a river carving stone over time. Loss arrived without warning. Accounts once full began to dwindle, contracts fell through, and his influence waned as quickly as it had risen. Those who had smiled with him in grand rooms now avoided his gaze. Invitations ceased. Praise fell silent. And with each absence, each refusal, the emptiness in the corners of his home and heart deepened. He discovered a truth he had ignored, that power untempered by conscience could be undone quietly, and that the city, though slow to act, never forgot the debts owed. And then the city arranged it. A market square, crowded and sunlit, became a place no one had planned to cross paths, yet fate had decided otherwise. Vendors shouted, children ran between baskets of vegetables, and elders whispered prayers for the day's safety. Among the throng, she moved with ease, her steps measured, her presence commanding without demand. And he, striding in with old pride, did not yet see the storm gathering before him. The city itself watched, silent and knowing, as the currents of past and present converged. Their eyes met as if the universe had paused. Recognition struck him late, like a drumbeat after a silence too long. The woman he had dismissed, humiliated, and cast aside now stood before him with calm authority, her composure a sword sharper than any insult he could wield. Power shifted invisibly, without a word spoken. The city, the sun, and even the wind seemed to bear witness to the reversal. His arrogance faltered, replaced by a shock that rooted him in place. He saw clearly for the first time what he had thrown away: patience, dignity, loyalty, and love. Each memory of contempt, each act of dismissal, returned with cruel clarity. There was no apology to erase the years of neglect, no gesture to reclaim what had been lost. Regret filled him, a bitter and unrelenting punishment. The life he had thought untouchable had fractures too deep to mend. And she, standing tall and composed, embodied the justice that had come not through vengeance, but through endurance, patience, and unwavering integrity. She did not shout. She did not demand apologies. The crowd hushed itself instinctively as if even the city had learned to wait for her voice. Her silence was heavy with meaning, carrying the weight of 5 years of sorrow, endurance, and quiet growth. Those who once measured her by weakness now felt the force of dignity that did not need words to be understood. Each glance she gave, each calm step she took, was a statement stronger than any outburst. In that stillness, rage lost its power, and the city understood that patience, not vengeance, had carried her here. The memory of $10 burned softly in her mind, never needing to be shown or waved as evidence. That small sum, once a weapon of humiliation, now echoed as a symbol of survival and transformation. She carried it in memory only, a quiet reminder of how far she had risen and how deeply she had endured. Every whisper of that past cruelty only strengthened her resolve and her composure, making her presence in the city a lesson of subtle, undeniable power. Kama moved quietly, without ceremony or clamor. It did not wear shoes to announce its coming. Yet it came nonetheless, in the unraveling of arrogance and the subtle recognition of integrity. Justice unfolded as naturally as the sun rises over the city, neither cruel nor loud. Those who had scorned her now observed her calm authority, feeling the quiet balance of the universe as it restored order. No one needed to witness vengeance. The moral weight of actions and patience was enough to set the scales right. The city, which had once ignored her, now seemed to bow in silent recognition. The patient were rewarded, tradition vindicated, and the lessons of endurance honored. She moved with calm power, her steps measured, her eyes steady. The applause she did not seek followed her quietly in conversations, in nods of respect, in subtle acknowledgments of the woman who had waited, endured, and grown. The moment of climax was not marked by spectacle, but by the still, undeniable strength of a life reclaimed. Her heart, once trembling with grief and anger, finally stilled. Tears came softly, not in fury, but in release. The layers of sorrow lifted slowly, leaving space for reflection, understanding, and quiet peace. She did not forget the past, but she no longer allowed it to define her. In her chest, a calm settled, rooted in her father's teachings. Honor the past, respect yourself, and endure with dignity. She carried her father's wisdom like a lantern, illuminating each choice she made. Decisions were guided not by impulse or revenge, but by the values he had taught her: integrity, patience, and compassion. In the city that had once sought to break her, she walked as a living testament to family, tradition, and moral strength. Her legacy was not shouted from rooftops. It was felt quietly, deeply, and enduringly by all who came into contact with her presence. She carried forgiveness carved deep into her soul, a quiet fire that needed no audience, no announcement, no reconciliation with the man who had betrayed her. It was not words that healed her, but understanding that true power comes from letting go. She would not return to what had tried to break her. Instead, she walked forward, each step measured, each breath a testament to the strength of patience and moral clarity. The city watched, as it always did, but she no longer sought its approval. Her silence was louder than any confrontation, and her dignity far heavier than the $10 that once humiliated her. Across the city, he sat in the shadow of the wealth he had amassed. The man who had once stood tall in polished shoes now felt the emptiness of a life built on ambition without heart. He saw the faces that once cheered for him turning away, the alliances that had been shallow crumbling quietly. For the first time, he understood what he had tossed away: loyalty, patience, and the love of a woman whose worth could not be measured in gold. Regret came too late, filling rooms that once echoed with applause, now silent except for the whispers of conscience he could not escape. The city itself seemed to conspire with fate. It revealed, in subtle ways, the destinies of those who abandoned tradition and integrity. Streets that once led to fortune now exposed fragility. Partners withdrew trust, neighbors measured actions with quiet disapproval, and the man who had sought only status realized the cost of neglecting his roots. Those who respected the old ways, those who honored family and morality, endured quietly. The city became a living witness, a moral mirror showing the consequences of choices made too lightly. Lessons were written in the corners where the sun barely reached, in the alleys where the city whispered truths. Wealth without compassion could not protect a man from loneliness. Integrity and humility, though often overlooked, shielded the soul and preserved honor. The elders had long told such stories. Justice does not always arrive at once, but it always arrives. And in the slow work of the city, the law of moral balance unfolded naturally, a rhythm older than any building or business deal. Betrayal may sleep, but it never dies. It waits in silence, patient, like seeds beneath dry earth. It does not seek vengeance in clamor, but in its own time, it rises, revealing the reckoning that was always destined. She had known this all along, carrying patience as her shield, letting the quiet work of justice unfold without interference. Fate, like a careful storyteller, ensured that balance was restored. She walked forward with steps unshaken, each movement precise, each gesture grounded in the knowledge of her worth. No longer did she carry the weight of loss or humiliation. The streets that once judged her silently now bore witness to her strength. Her head was held high, not in arrogance, but in the calm confidence of a life rebuilt on patience, morality, and unyielding dignity. Every glance she gave, every step she took, spoke louder than arguments or proclamations. She had turned pain into power, not through violence, but through endurance, reflection, and moral strength. The city watched quietly, sensing the justice embedded in her presence. There was no need for spectacle. Her mere existence was a lesson in patience, resilience, and the triumph of inner strength. And yet the city moved on. Life continued. Children ran along the dusty streets, vendors called out their wares, elders debated under the shade of the baobab. But she had become part of it in a way that no one could challenge. She moved among the people with ease, yet above the petty judgments that had once sought to define her. Her legacy, quiet, dignified, morally complete, was sealed. The city remembered, as African tales always do, and the lesson endured: honor, patience, and integrity cannot be stolen, and those who live by them will outlast the fleeting power of betrayal.